You wouldn't survive a day. Here's why. Number 10. You'd be starving long before the fighting started. You think a medieval siege meant constant combat? Think again. The real enemy wasn't outside the walls. It was in your gut. Because the first thing to die in a siege was your food supply. Most medieval cities didn't stockpile grain like doomsday preppers. They relied on daily trade. And once the enemy army cut off the roads and ports, that supply line vanished. Fast. In a matter of days, the market stalls were bare, the bread ovens cold, the butchers long gone. Suddenly, a city of 10,000 had to survive on whatever it already had. And even if you were lucky enough to be inside a well-fortified city with granaries, those stores weren't built for long sieges. They had weevils, they had rats, they had corrupt officials, who always seemed to eat better than the rest. In the 1097 siege of Nicaea, citizens reportedly gnawed on leather straps and hay. At the siege of Rouen in 1418, the starving population ate dogs, cats, and finally, the bodies of the dead. And no, that's not exaggeration. Chronicler Thomas Bazin wrote plainly, some ate the flesh of corpses and others of their own children. Think you'd last a day without breakfast? Try 3 weeks on sawdust bread and boiled shoe leather. Number 9. Disease was the only thing that spread faster than fear. There was no clean water, there were no toilets, and there were definitely no quarantine zones. Once the siege began, the city turned into a sealed-off cesspool, a perfect breeding ground for every disease known to man, and some still unknown. You didn't just smell the stench, you lived in it. Latrines overflowed, chamber pots were dumped into the streets, rotting carcasses from the enemy's trebuchets were lobbed over the walls, decomposing cows, plague-ridden corpses, even buckets of human waste, all part of a strategy called biological warfare. Yes, it existed in the Middle Ages. The Mongols used it at the Siege of Kaffa in 1346, slinging plague-infected corpses into the besieged Genoese city. The result? A full-blown outbreak. Survivors fled by ship, carrying the Black Death into Europe, killing over 25 million people. But even without the bubonic plague, cities still had typhoid, dysentery, and good old-fashioned salmonella. One sip of contaminated water and you'd be doubled over in agony, too weak to even stand when the real fighting started. And don't think the nobility had it better. Disease didn't care if you were rich. Kings died just like peasants, only on nicer beds. Number 8. Your own walls could kill you. You think the castle walls would protect you? They were just as likely to crush you. Because once the siege weapons rolled in, catapults, mangonels, trebuchets, your walls became the enemy's bullseye, and you were standing behind them. When the siege of Thessalonica began in 904, Arab attackers used fire-laden siege engines to batter the city's defences. The result? Entire sections of wall collapsed onto the crowded homes and streets inside, crushing men, women, and children before the attackers even broke through. And if you were assigned to defend the walls, good luck. You'd be up there, dodging arrows, fire pots, boiling oil, and boulders the size of oxen. At the Siege of Acre in 1291, defenders on the walls were decapitated by trebuchet-launched projectiles. In the Siege of Lisbon in 1147, defenders were flung off their parapets by the sheer force of incoming fire. Just standing up to return fire could get your head taken off by a crossbow bolt. Even the walls themselves could be sabotaged. Siege engineers used tunnelling or sapping to dig beneath your walls and collapse them from below. They'd burn support beams using pitch and sulphur, and you'd hear it right before your section caved in. 1 second you're guarding the rampart, next second you're 30 feet underground, buried under limestone and corpses. Number 7. You could be forced to eat the dead or become one. You think starvation was bad? You haven't seen what comes after, because when the food runs out and the rats are gone, and even the dogs have disappeared, the line between survival and savagery disappears with them. In the 1098 siege of Ma'arat al-Numan, during the First Crusade, eyewitness accounts report that Christian crusaders, yes, the supposed holy warriors, resorted to cannibalism. Chronicler Radolf of Caen wrote that they boiled pagan adults and impaled children on spits to eat their flesh. Let that sit for a second. This wasn't a last resort by a few madmen. This was an organised, documented survival tactic. And it wasn't unique. At the 1573 siege of Haarlem, Dutch soldiers admitted to cooking the flesh of Spanish captives just to keep their garrisons from deserting. You wouldn't last a day because you'd refuse to eat a corpse, and then you'd become one. Number 6. The enemy didn't wait for you to die. They helped. If you're picturing a long, passive wait behind castle walls, think again. Medieval besiegers were creative and terrifyingly hands-on. Let's talk siege engines, not just catapults or battering rams. Those were the warm-up act. The main event? Siege towers. Massive multi-story wooden fortresses on wheels, taller than your castle walls, filled with archers, crossbowmen and spearmen. They'd roll them right up to your ramparts, unleashing death from above and breaching your defences with gangplanks. At the 1203 siege of Constantinople, attackers used covered battering towers with drawbridges that dropped directly onto the walls, allowing shock troops to spill inside. And once that happened, no rules, no mercy, no survivors, but the psychological warfare was just as bad. In 1428, the English at the Siege of Orleans built a tower out of wood, placed French prisoners at the top, and dared the defenders to fire on their own men. In other sieges, bodies of diseased prisoners or executed spies were catapulted over the walls. Not to kill, but to contaminate, to send a message, you're already dead. Still think hiding behind stone was safe? They didn't just attack the gates, they came for your mind. Number 5. You'd be crushed in the first counterattack. Let's say the siege drags on, your city survives weeks of starvation and terror, and, somehow, you're still breathing. Now it's your turn to fight back. Congratulations, you've just signed your death warrant, because a sally, a counterattack from inside the walls, was one of the most desperate and brutal actions a medieval soldier could be part of. Usually done at night, under moonlight, with absolute silence until the moment of contact. You'd be one of maybe 100 poorly fed, sleep-deprived fighters sprinting out of the gate toward enemy trenches packed with sharpened stakes, pits and caltrops, all while dodging arrows and trying to take out siege engines before reinforcements wake up. If you survived the charge, you'd now have to burn, dismantle, or sabotage machines, twice your height, under torchlight, while being hunted by elite enemy troops. At the 1346 siege of Calais, French knights launched multiple sallies to destroy English siege towers. Most never made it back. They were cut down in the dark, speared in pits or taken prisoner, only to be ransomed, tortured, or executed. Worst part? If you made it back to the gate and the defenders thought you were infected or compromised, they wouldn't open it. Yes, locked out, trapped between the enemy lines and your own walls. So after weeks of surviving starvation, disease, and bombardment, you'd die on your own doorstep. Number 4. You could be used as human shield or burned alive. When the enemy finally breaches your outer defences, there's no clean last stand. There's panic, screaming, betrayal, and then cruelty that defies belief. Because medieval attackers didn't just rush in with swords drawn, they used you. At the 1258 siege of Baghdad, Mongol invaders forced prisoners, including women and children, to march ahead of the troops, absorbing arrows and breaking enemy lines. At the siege of Béziers in 1209, it didn't matter who you were, Catholic, heretic, priest or peasant. The order was clear: kill them all, God will know his own. The city burned, inside the churches, inside the homes, while people were still inside them. Defenders sometimes tried to barricade the gates with rubble and furniture. But when the flames came, wood turned to tinder. Oil, wax and resin accelerated the blaze. You couldn't breathe, you couldn't see, you couldn't escape. At the 1212 siege of Rochester, King John ordered the miners to burn pig fat under the keep's walls. The resulting fire brought the entire tower crashing down. Those inside were either crushed or cooked alive. So if you're imagining one last heroic moment in the throne room with your sword held high, forget it. Your final act is smoke in your lungs, fire in your face, and the sound of stone collapsing above you. Number 3. Betrayal was more likely than rescue. Hope kills. And in a siege, hope came in the form of relief armies. But here's the truth, they almost never came. And when they did, it was often too late. Or worse, a trap. Cities surrendered not when their walls broke, but when their spirits did. And that spirit usually died at the hands of someone inside. At the 1204 sack of Constantinople, a Christian city fell. Not to the Muslim world, but to fellow Christians in the Fourth Crusade. The defenders were betrayed from within. Doors opened, blood spilled, libraries burned, nuns were raped in the streets. At the siege of Antioch in 1098, it was a traitor, an Armenian guard named Firuz, who let the Crusaders in. Just one man opened a postern gate and doomed an entire city. Even local nobles weren't reliable. If they sensed the city couldn't hold, they might flee in the night, or cut a secret deal for their own survival. You'd never know until the enemy walked in, and if you were one of the unlucky poor, the city's elite might toss you out before then, to conserve food, maintain order, or just show obedience. Just like in the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, where tens of thousands were cast outside the walls, left to rot between the armies. Your death wouldn't be glorious, it would be administrative. Number 2, surrender didn't save you. Let's say you've made it this far. You didn't starve, you didn't get the plague, you didn't burn or get crushed or betrayed. You surrendered, and you still wouldn't survive, because in medieval warfare, surrender didn't guarantee safety. It often guaranteed a massacre. At the 1291 siege of Acre, after the Mamluks breached the city, thousands of surrendered defenders were executed. Some beheaded, others drowned, all with no mercy. At Béziers, again, 20,000 people, surrendered, praying, begging, all murdered within hours. At the 1370 siege of Limoges, the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, ordered the execution of 3,000 civilians after taking the town, despite their surrender. Why? Because keeping prisoners was expensive, feeding them was impossible, and letting them go, dangerous. And if you were spared, it wasn't a kindness. It was commerce. You'd be sold into slavery, chained and marched for days. The strong pulled into labour, the weak left to die, families separated, children auctioned. The sword wasn't your only ending. A life in chains was just as common, just as brutal. Number 1. When the city fell, hell began. This is what it all builds to. The food is gone. The walls are breached. The enemy is inside. This is not a battle. This is annihilation. A medieval sack wasn't a strategic occupation. It was chaos unleashed. Soldiers unpaid for months were finally allowed to take what they were promised. And what they took was everything. They looted gold, silver, and relics, yes, but also clothing, children, and women. Entire households were destroyed. Families slaughtered, or worse, separated, humiliated, and broken. At the sack of Magdeburg in 1631, during the 30 Years' War, over 20,000 civilians were killed in a single day. Women were raped to death. Children were nailed to doors. Priests were murdered at the altar. The city's nickname afterward? Magdeburg Quarter, because only a quarter of its population survived. Fires burned for days. Disease spread from the corpses. Survivors stumbled through ruins, blind from smoke, mad with grief. And if you had hoped to find safety in a church, think again. Those were often targeted first. If you enjoyed the video, you can watch another one here.